A Murder in the Park by Devi. "Hey, Allie, come here," Tyler yelled. He was loud enough to disturb every damn bird in the forest. He was also marching along, breaking branches and stomping on leaves, oblivious to fitting into nature. Tyler was a city boy, not only at heart, but in every way. Allison was still surprised he had come on this trip at all. Alison, not Allie, please, for the millionth time, she said, slightly irritated. "Guys, wait up!" That was Betty, who was at least 25 feet behind them, shuffling along the thin, rocky trail, looking put upon. She dragged a backpack behind her, letting it bounce off the dry stick and leaf-covered dirt. Her pale blonde hair hung in her face. "This is just perfect. We'll stay here." "Perfect," Tyler repeated, apparently to himself, since neither of the girls bothered to answer him. Graduation had been last week, and next came college. They were going their separate ways, and Allison knew from her past of changing cities and towns often that it would be hard on all three of them. She had suggested this trip as a way to say, not goodbye, but to have one last adventure before real life swallowed them up. None of them had ever been to Grand Teton National Park, despite living in Montana, which was so close to Wyoming. Allison had grown up in California, Washington, and Montana, while the other two teenagers were born and raised in small Montana towns. Betty would be attending MSUB, Montana State University Billings, so the three of them had decided to go to the park in Wyoming. Besides, there was a canyon called the Canyon of Death, and what could be cooler than that? Actually, truth be told, Tyler's "Suck it, Yellowstone" had been the deciding factor, as the three of them had laughed hysterically in Betty's kitchen one evening while looking parks up on her laptop. "Come here," Tyler yelled again, sounding more and more impatient. "This is it. Allison, Betty, you too, come here." "I've known you for 6 years and you still can't remember to call me Allison?" she said as she walked into what would be their campsite. It was merely a very small clearing in the forest, not more than a somewhat circular area of flat dirt. She put her hand on her hip and mock glared at Tyler, who was a tall, athletic 18-year-old with thick brown hair cut into a mohawk with stunning green eyes. Most of the girls at school swooned over him, but Allison had been uninterested, which is why they had become friends. The fact that she didn't drool when talking to him made him happy. "You only changed your damn name to Allison last year when you turned 17, for God's sakes. Allie used to be fine." Tyler stuck his tongue out to her dramatically. "Isn't this a great place to camp, though?" "Yes, Tyler, it's amazing," she admitted. The canyon lay open before them, far below. It was simply exquisite. Betty had finally reached the small clearing in the trees. She threw her backpack down and sighed deeply. "It's great by me. I'm tired of walking." Betty also was immune to Tyler's charms. That was because she had known him since they had spent their days playing hide-and-seek in daycare. It was hard to find someone attractive when he had seen them eat dirt. Allison put her backpack down on the ground and stood up to face the view. They had traveled along the Death Canyon trail shelf and now had a stunning view of the sunset. As the sun slid behind the majestic mountains, the sky became orange and yellow, the clouds themselves looking unnatural but beautiful. Rays of sunshine fought to stay above the sharp contrast of Mount Moran's rock, shooting out into the sky. The mountains themselves had begun to have an almost bluish tint as they lost the light. The trees were starkly green against them. "This really is a beautiful spot to camp," Betty remarked. "We had better get our fire going, though. The sun will be gone soon." "Agreed," Tyler said. "I'll get us some wood." I hear water nearby, Betty said and headed off to find it, her thermos in hand. Okay, I'll just stay here and put the tent up, Allison said to herself. She hummed as she worked at getting the tent up. It was a 3-man tent she had borrowed from her Uncle Stephen. He liked camping and had offered to loan her the tent, sleeping bags, a small pot to cook in with some metal forks and spoons, a flashlight, and a lighter to start a fire. She had nearly turned him down, but then realized how much it would cost to buy all that stuff. She wasn't even sure yet that she liked camping. Better to find out before investing a bunch of money in it. He had offered her a gun, which she had refused to take. Guns scared her. Caw-caw! Allison turned from the tent, which she had just finished with. There were 3 crows on the edge of the clearing, watching her. As she watched, a 4th, then 5th, landed near them. Well, hello there, she said, and immediately felt foolish for speaking out loud and to birds. 4 of them took flight, disappearing into the forest to the far side of the camping spot. The remaining crow merely stood where it was, continuing to watch her. Caw! Allison walked to her backpack, sure that the crow would fly away from her moving around. To her surprise, instead of flying away, it hopped a few steps closer to her and stopped again, staring. Caw! She reached her backpack, unzipped it, and pulled out a baggie of grapes. Allison wasn't sure if crows liked grapes, but this one seemed to want something from her. She opened the bag and took out a plump green grape. Here you go. Is this what you want? She gently tossed the grape towards the bird. The crow fluttered around a bit, but held its ground. Allison was surprised that the grape landed within a few inches of him. She wasn't the best at throwing. He snapped at it with his powerful beak. In 2 bites, it was gone. Well, that was fast, she said, and tossed over another one. Caw! The crow said, seeming to agree. Allison kept feeding him, feeling both fascinated and excited to be this close to nature. She had never seen a crow this close up. He had 1 white feather on his left wing, which was very noticeable against the shiny black of the rest of him. One of his eyes must have been blind because it had a milky dullness to it. He seemed perfectly happy to stay as long as she kept giving him grapes. In fact, when they ran out, Allison gave him some of her crackers. The whole time she talked to him. She found herself telling him about the trip up there. As she talked, he tilted his head at her as if listening intently. Tyler and Betty are my best friends, but I'm afraid I'm going to lose them now that we are all out of high school. Betty is going to college in Billings, and Tyler is off to Missoula. As for me, well, I'm not sure yet. She tossed over another cracker. I know you have to leave sometime, but I wish it didn't have to be so sudden, I guess. Caw-caw! Suddenly the crow took flight. It was only a matter of seconds and he was gone into the trees. Don't go! Allison cried out, shocked and saddened. Who are you talking to? Tyler asked, his arms full of branches. Allison turned around quickly, startled. No one, she said, but she scanned the trees for any signs of her new friend. The fire was built just in time. It would be dark soon. A lazy and bloated moon was coming up. The flower moon, it was called in May. Large and bright, it gave off enough light to see, even without the roaring fire that Tyler kept insisting on throwing tons of branches on. You're going to run out of wood and have to look for more, Betty commented, scooting back a few feet from the flaming inferno. We aren't even supposed to have a fire out here in the backcountry. You heard the ranger. We could get in serious trouble for that, Allison said. Stop worrying so much, ladies. I know perfectly well what I'm doing. No rangers are going to suddenly appear out here in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night and slap on the handcuffs. As for getting more wood, the moon is bright enough. I won't have a problem. Says the man who camps all the time, Betty said with pure sarcasm. Hey, I watch movies. I've seen people camp. Friday the 13th doesn't count. Allison laughed. Okay, you two, let's eat something and you can bicker later. They roasted hot dogs over the fire, laughing and talking about senior year at high school, summer plans, and the upcoming year. Afterward, marshmallows were roasted and burned on the same sticks as they had cooked the hot dogs on. They ate too many, and the sugar high was enough to keep them chattering on long after midnight. Allie, Betty, come here, Tyler yelled. He was busy putting more wood on the fire while the girls had gone to go to the bathroom. No need to yell, we're already back, Allison said. And it's Allison. You really are a lost cause. It's the most fun time of the night, he announced, ignoring her comment. He gestured dramatically with his arms. It's urban legend time. Oh, heck no, Betty said. Oh, heck yes, Tyler countered. Allison shrugged. She wasn't easily frightened. I have a really scary story for you ladies tonight, and the best part is, it's all true. Tyler grinned at them, trying to look threatening, Allison guessed. He looked more like a cartoon shark. Betty scooted closer to Allison and took hold of her arm in any case. She didn't like being scared. Not too scary, okay? Allison warned. Tyler frowned. Okay, he sighed, and then the toothy grin was back. It happened years ago. Why, in this very park. It may have been on this trail, in fact. Allison patted Betty's hand reassuringly, and Betty gave her a smile. Somewhere in the woods, a crow cawed, and a distance off, another answered. After all, Tyler continued, there is a reason this is called Death Canyon. And, of course, Death Canyon Trail. Why, this could be the very spot where they died, those poor men. Allison? Betty's grip had tightened on Allison's arm to the point of being painful, and her eyes had widened. At first, Allison thought she was already getting caught up in Tyler's stupid theatrics, but then she realized that Betty wasn't looking at Tyler. She was looking toward the woods. There was a man standing there. It all began when they went camping, just like us. They had made their campsite and were settling down for the night when... Tyler! Allison said sharply and pointed at the man who was off to Tyler's left. Tyler turned and snapped his mouth shut with an audible click of his teeth. The man just stood there. The teenagers just looked at him, no one moving or speaking. After what felt like an eternity but was only a few seconds, he took a jolting step forward, and then another, towards the campfire. What the hell? Tyler said under his breath. He stood up. Hey, who are you? The man didn't answer, but stumbled a few steps closer. The moon was behind the clouds, and he was too far from the firelight to make out any of his features. Allison and Betty got up and moved behind Tyler. Now the fire was between the three of them and the stranger. He kept moving closer, but very slowly and awkwardly. Every 2 or 3 steps he would stumble, almost fall, and then right himself again. Betty was breathing fast, her fear obvious. What does he want? She whispered. Are you drunk, mister? Tyler yelled, as if being drunk meant also being deaf. Allison bent down and picked up one of the bigger sticks they had collected to burn. She kept her eyes on the man and his forward progress. Her heart felt like it might explode from fear. Tyler meant well, but she had seen him fight before. They didn't stand a chance if it came down to that. Just as the stranger reached a point where the firelight would illuminate him, the moon came back out from behind the clouds. It was nearly bright as day. Betty started screaming. The man stood across the fire from them, his abdomen cut open from one side of his body to the other, intestines hanging part of the way out and cupped in his hands. Blood poured from the wound, and Allison wondered, too calmly, how he was even still alive. She tore her eyes away from that sight and looked up to his face, which was ashen. His mouth was opening and closing, but only a whisper was coming out, and she couldn't hear the words. What's he saying? Tyler asked, his voice shaking. He had his hands on Betty's shoulders for comfort, or perhaps support. I don't know. Allison wanted to get away from the man, wanted desperately for this not to be happening. Instead, she stepped a little closer to him, listening intently. What? She asked. The man's eyes locked with hers. Allison felt a chill go through her whole body. She knew she was looking at a dead man. It was only a matter of minutes or seconds. Somewhere off in the woods, a crow cawed loudly. The man wavered and almost fell, then balanced himself again. His eyes stayed on Allison as he spoke once again, this time repeating himself over and over, a little louder each time. Run. 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 Run! Allison finally heard. The chill that had gone through her intensified. The man opened his mouth to speak again, but all that came out was a large bubble of blood. It exploded and the man collapsed to the ground, narrowly missing the fire. Betty screamed again and pointed to his back. There was a hunting knife buried between his shoulder blades. The three teenagers stood silently, staring at the body. The woods, which surrounded them on three sides, had an eerie silence to it. The fourth side was the cliff trail that led down to the Death Canyon. Allison's mind was racing. They could run, but to where? The trail they had taken to the campsite? It was at least 1 a.m, and while the moon was bright, much of the trail was through the forest and would be very dark. What did he say, Allie? Tyler asked, his arms wrapped tightly around Betty. She was crying against his chest. He suggested we... She paused, listening. The sound of snapping branches could clearly be heard. He suggested we run, and I think we better do it right now because I hear someone coming. They aren't too far off either. What about our just run? Allison hissed under her breath and shoved him toward Devil Canyon Trail. Tyler pushed Betty away from him, turned her toward the trail as if she was a doll he commanded, and told her to run. She was wild-eyed and still sobbing, but she did as she was told and took off. Allison headed after her, and Tyler followed. It didn't take long for him to start to bypass Allison, though, even though she had been in track and field at school. Betty was by far the slowest, being a bit chubby and not interested in sports at all. Tyler stayed behind the girls, though, turning his head every few seconds to check the trail behind. A cloud sailed over the full moon just as the trail led into a thick grove of quaking aspen trees. With all light cut off, the trail was difficult at best to follow. Their progress was slowed considerably, but that wasn't the only reason. Betty finally came to a stop, breathing heavily. She looked around frantically, her eyes still wild. I can't, she breathed. Keep running. Allison peered hard into the darkness they had come from. She listened intently but didn't hear anything. In fact, she didn't even hear the forest animals. The only sound was Betty's labored breathing and the quiet trembling of the tree leaves in the slight breeze. I don't hear anything, but we really have to get to the ranger station, she whispered. Do you think he's after us? Tyler whispered back. Like stalking us? He? Betty managed to look even more terrified. Well, I'm assuming bears don't use knives, so yeah, he. Or I guess it could be she, Tyler said without humor. He looked only slightly less terrified than Betty. We should keep on the trail as best we can. I wish we could have brought a flashlight. Allison wasn't focused on Tyler because it was hard to look at Betty. Her terror was painful to see since Allison didn't know what to do to reassure her friend. Betty had leaned up against one of the aspen trees, only 6 or 7 feet away, trying to catch her breath. Her eyes were closed, but she was far from calm, and her breathing was still ragged. Neither Allison nor Tyler saw any danger at all until it was too late. One moment they were whispering, and the next they heard a thud and a gurgling sound. Both looked at Betty immediately. Her eyes were open and filled with terror. Her mouth was wide open, but instead of a scream coming out, a thick gush of blood flowed from it like it was an open wound and poured down her chin. An arrow had impaled her throat, sticking her to the aspen tree. Her mouth worked for a few more seconds, trying to speak, but only a fountain of blood came. Betty's eyes glazed over and her body went limp, still unbelievably held up by the metal-shafted arrow. No! Tyler yelled and ran to Betty. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her violently. Betty! No! Allison scanned the trees around them. How could someone have gotten a shot off in this dense of trees? She ran to Tyler and grabbed his shoulder. We have to get out of here, now! We can't leave her like this. We have to help her, Tyler cried out, unnoticed tears streaming down his face. He looked out of his mind. She's dead, Tyler. We will be too if we don't get out of here. Even as she said that, she felt something zip by her head. An arrow lodged into the tree next to her. Come on! We have to go! Allison grabbed Tyler by the upper arm and pulled him as hard as she could away from Betty. He resisted at first, but finally he let her move him and they began to run again. This time Tyler led the way, and Allison could hear his sobs even as he ran. She wouldn't let herself cry. Not yet. Not until they were safe. Not until the psycho chasing them was stopped. Allison didn't feel she could afford to cry yet. She couldn't allow herself to feel anything, even the terror that was threatening to immobilize her. The Lawrence S. Rockefeller Preserve Center Ranger Station was approximately 4 miles from where they had camped. Their car was 3 miles past that. Allison figured all they had to do was make it to the ranger station and they would be safe. Certainly the ranger would be there. He had to be. She prayed he would be. After what felt like hours, but in reality was only about 15 minutes, Tyler came to a stop. He was breathing heavily and sweat was pouring off his face. It wasn't a hot night. It was the beginning of May and the weather was just beginning to warm up. On the trail, they had seen some small patches of snow at higher elevations. I need to stop a minute, he said, and sat down on the trail. Allison nodded and sat down next to him. She was tired too, but doing track and field for years had given her more stamina. I can't stop seeing Betty, Tyler started, then stopped. He gritted his teeth, trying not to cry. Allison put her arm around his shoulder. I know, me too. Who would do something like that? Why? She never hurt anyone. Some sicko. They sat like that for a while, Tyler quietly crying and Allison listening intently for any sounds of someone approaching. After a while, Allison realized that Tyler had fallen asleep leaning against her. She decided to let him rest for a while. She slid away from him, gently and quietly lowering him to the ground. He didn't wake up. She had heard water running and remembered that there was a creek nearby. It would be wonderful to have a drink. Once Tyler woke up, she could have him go get some too. All their supplies were back at their camp. They had literally escaped with the clothes on their backs and nothing else. Allison took a moment to scan the trees and listen again. They were alone. She was sure of it. The creek was a bit further away than it had sounded. Without a trail, the going was a bit rough. The forest floor was covered with broken branches, rocks covered with slick moss, bushes with thorns and mud. A few times, Allison almost lost a shoe to the thick mud. It was worth it when she reached the creek and tasted the clean, cold water. She hadn't realized just how thirsty she had been. Allison washed her face off, drank some more water, and then decided she had better get back to Tyler before he woke up and found her gone. Certainly he would panic if she wasn't there. After walking for a good 10 minutes, Allison realized that she was lost. It hadn't taken her this long to get to the creek, and yet the trail was nowhere in sight. She was afraid to yell out Tyler's name for fear of alerting the murderer of their whereabouts, if he was even still following them. She didn't really want to find out. She just wanted to get Tyler and get to the ranger. Allison stopped and looked around, but the moon was of little help in this part of the forest. The trees were everywhere, their branches thick with new spring leaves. They blocked the moonlight from ever hitting the forest floor. She resisted the urge to just sit down, back to a tree, and go to sleep. She had never felt this exhausted in her entire life, but it wasn't safe out here, and besides, Tyler was out here too, alone, and probably afraid something had happened to her. For all she knew, he was searching for her. Perhaps she could call out just once, in case he was close enough to hear her. Marco! Allison yelled as loud as she could manage. It was something that they had often done to embarrass each other at stores. When one of 3 of them would wander off, the other 2 would yell Marco until the missing person would answer Polo. just like that old pool game kids played. No response. Tears welled up in Allison's eyes. What if Tyler was dead like Betty? What if it was just her now? Stuck out here in the woods with some psychopath. She should never have left Tyler alone. How stupid could she have been? What had she been thinking? Allie, come here, a voice said, far off to the left where Allison stood. Tyler? Is that you? She yelled, feeling as if it wasn't, but wanting it to be so badly. The voice was wrong somehow. Allie, come, it said again. Who are you? Allison backed up a few steps, preparing herself to run if necessary. I know you aren't Tyler. Just as she decided she had imagined the whole exchange, she saw something darker than the night swoop down out of the trees on the left. She jumped back, but it landed a good 6 feet from her. It was the crow, the one with the white feather on its wing. Allie, come! It said again and made a rattling sound at her. How can you talk? What are you? The crow tilted its head at her. Melancon, it said. Allie, come! Go with you? She asked. She thought she had heard once that crows could mimic speech, but this was a lot to take in. Also, that it had a name and used it. Not safe. Melancon flapped his wings and lifted off the ground. He flew off to the left where she had originally heard him. Allison thought for a moment, then decided to follow him. It couldn't be any worse than standing here beating herself up. Traveling as the crow flies may seem like the faster option to those that can't do it, but in Allison's opinion it was anything but easy. She found herself climbing over dead trees, scaling small rock formations, and trying to find her way around thick, muddy areas. Twice she had to go across creeks, getting her shoes wet. Every time she would fall behind, she would hear what was becoming the only thing keeping her going. Melancon. Allie, come here, he would call. I'm going as fast as I can, Melancon, she would say tiredly, and then she would go to the direction of his voice. Even the fear had mostly left her. It was dark, and she had no idea what animals might be out there that would gladly eat her. She thought she heard a mountain lion off in the distance at one point. That or the killer had struck again. It had sounded like a woman's scream. I have to rest, Allison announced, and sat down on a partially rotted log. She didn't know if Melancon understood the things she said or not, but she was wore out. Allison thought about just staying where she was. Maybe someone would eventually find her. Maybe someone hiking or camping or a search party. Or the killer. She got wearily back to her feet and got moving again. She needed to find Tyler, at the very least. Are we almost there, Melancon? She asked the next time she saw him. He was sitting on a tree limb watching her. There, he said, seeming to agree. Allie, come. He flew off. For all I know, you're leading me deeper into the woods, she muttered. They continued on, and Allison started to wonder just where Melancon was taking her. She had hoped to safety, but did a bird even know what that was? She also wanted to know why it was still so dark out when she felt like she had been walking for hours and hours. Certainly the sun had to come up at some point, and soon. Not that she would be any less lost in the daylight. Allison was lost in thought when suddenly Melancon was there, right in her face, flapping its large black wings. Not safe, he cried. Without even thinking, Allison scanned the ground for somewhere to hide. She saw a somewhat hollowed-out log and ran to it. It was barely big enough for her to back into, but she did her best. Allison imagined it was probably full of all manner of insects and possibly snakes, but right now she didn't care. She had to hide. Melancon landed above her on top of the rotted log. Allison couldn't see him, but she could hear his feet as he paced back and forth on the log, and could hear him making a throaty, rattling sound. She closed her eyes tight, not really wanting to see what the danger was for fear of screaming. Instead, she told herself to calm down, to breathe regularly and quietly. She was at her home in bed, she told herself, home, safe and sound. The throaty rattling had turned to a sharp, rapid cawing, as if Melancon was attempting to scare something off. It ruined any illusion that Allison was home safe in her home. She opened her eyes just a little bit and nearly did scream. Not 12 feet away from her was a mountain lion. It was sniffing the air and looking this way and that, presumably searching for her. Malankon flew off the log and dived at the big cat, who hissed and reared back, burying its fangs. It batted a huge paw at the crow, but Malankon was too fast and moved easily away, only to dive bomb the cat again from behind. The mountain lion whirled around, facing the crow once again, but Malankon just flew behind it. After doing this several more times, the big cat gave one final hiss and raced away into the woods. Allison stayed where she was for another 10 minutes, despite it being painful to be hunkered down in the log. She was still terrified that the cat would come back and kill her. Never before in her entire life had she felt and sustained this level of fear before. She wondered if her heart would eventually give out from the stress of it. "Allie, come," Malankon said from the top of the log. "Allie's safe." She crawled out on her hands and knees, feeling tiny sticks biting into the palms of her hands. Any hope that this was a nightmare were dashed by the fact that she could feel everything so acutely. Pulling herself up by grabbing the top of the log, she finally stood again. Her feet were horribly sore and numb from being cold and wet. Her sweatshirt was covered with mud, but at least it was some protection from the chill in the air. Her jeans were ripped in several places, and there were scratches on her legs where branches had caught her flesh. Despite all that, she was still alive. That was the important thing. "I hope we are almost there, Malankon. I don't think I can walk much further." It wasn't long before the sky began to lighten up in the east and the woods started to thin out. The sun rose just as Allison walked out of the woods and into the clearing that was the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Preserve Ranger Station. She breathed a sigh of relief. She had never been happier to see a man-made building in her entire life. She wanted to run to the front door of the station, but there was no way she could run anymore. Her legs were barely keeping her upright as it was. Instead, she stumbled forward, lurching her way towards it. Malankon suddenly flew in front of her, stopping her. She waited a moment, then started moving again. "Not safe," Malankon said urgently and flew in front of her face, flapping his wings at her. Allison looked around at the meadow that surrounded the preserve center. She didn't see any danger. No mountain lion, no killer. Nothing but grass slowly swaying in the breeze. "It's safe, Malankon. I've got to get to the ranger. I have to get to that building." He flew in front of her again, trying to stop her from going toward the building. She tried to shoo him away, but he wouldn't budge. Just then, the door of the ranger station opened and the ranger stood there. He was a large man with wide shoulders. He had to duck down to step outside or his head would have hit. As he stepped outside, Malankon flew up into a nearby tree. Allison felt relief wash over her at the sight of the ranger, but it was short-lived. He had blood all over him. She gasped. Had the killer gotten here already? Was she too late? "Oh, don't worry," the ranger said to her. "It's not my blood." She frowned. What did that mean? Malankon and now several other crows cawed from the trees above and behind her. They made rattling noises that signified danger. "That stupid Malankon at it again, huh?" the ranger asked. He spit. "Should have killed him when I had him caged. Some pet he turned out to be." "What?" Allison asked, still trying to make sense of all of this. She was so tired and so terrified. And what was the ranger doing with all that blood on him? What did he mean that Malankon had been a pet? She noticed he had something on his forehead. They looked like those night goggles that military people used. "It's you?" she finally asked. "Of course it's me, you stupid little bitch. You kids come up here every year and misuse the forest. You come up here and start your fires and leave your trash. Well, I don't have to put up with that." "You're crazy." "Maybe, but you're dead." The ranger smiled, showing very white teeth. He came towards her slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. Allison knew she should run away, but didn't have the energy to move her legs. They felt like jello. Instead, she just stood there like a deer in the headlights of a truck, waiting for it to hit and kill her. Allison closed her eyes. She wished she could say goodbye to her parents. Kiss her grandma on the cheek one more time. Hug her dog. She wished she knew what had happened to Tyler and if he was still alive. "Stay away from her, you son of a bitch!" Tyler yelled. Allison's eyes flew open in time to see Tyler coming from inside the cabin. He looked like hell. His mohawk was caked with blood and standing up in clumped spikes. His face was streaked with more blood and also dirt, as were his arms, hands, and t-shirt. It was obvious that he had been badly wounded as he held one hand to his gut and fresh blood was coming out between his fingers. The ranger turned around quickly. "I killed you!" he yelled back. "It didn't take," Tyler growled and shuffled toward the killer. "No!" Allison screamed. It was too much. She had already thought Tyler was dead. Now that he wasn't, she knew she couldn't lose him again. She bent down and grabbed the only thing she could find to grab, a 4-foot-long branch. It wasn't anything special, but would surely get his attention. She found what strength she had remaining and sprinted at the ranger with pure hate in her heart. Once she reached him, she lifted it up and brought it down on top of his head. It made an explosive cracking noise, which was mostly the branch breaking in two. The ranger, surprised, whirled around to face Allison, forgetting entirely about Tyler. "Is that all you've got?" the ranger snarled at her. Allison smiled. It felt good. She smiled wide, and she meant every bit of it. "No," she said. "That isn't all." She stepped up to him quickly and brought her knee up in one movement, giving it more force that way, and hit him right between the legs. He doubled over and turned away from her, holding his groin. Tyler was there, waiting. "This is for Betty, you asshole!" he hissed and grabbed the ranger by the hair. He yanked his head down and brought his knee up as hard as he could, hitting the ranger square in the throat. The ranger fell to the ground, gasping for air through a crushed windpipe. Allison ran to Tyler and caught him just in time. He was falling to the ground. She put an arm under him and helped him walk to the doorway of the ranger station. "There has to be a phone in there. We'll call for help. You're going to be okay," she promised. Suddenly, she heard the crows. They were squawking, cawing, and flapping their wings. When Allison turned around, she saw that they were dive-bombing and attacking the ranger. She was pretty sure he was dying as it was. He couldn't breathe, but they were pecking at him and ripping at him with their talons. Malankon wasn't among them. Allison had never heard of crows attacking someone before. She was pretty sure this was an isolated incident. She couldn't say she was upset about it either. In fact, she felt that the man trying to protect his precious park had just been told what he could do with this particular brand of protection. There was a phone in the preserve center, and Allison immediately dialed 911. She explained quickly and very briefly, just enough that they would send someone as soon as possible. Then she sat on the floor with Tyler, praying he would be able to wait for help to come. He wouldn't let her see the wound, but it didn't seem to be bleeding as much when she had first arrived. "Allie." Allison turned her head toward the door and saw Malankon standing there. She smiled. She could still hear the other crows outside, squawking. "Malankon, thank you for helping me. I wouldn't be alive without you." He regarded her, one dark eye, one hazy white. He cawed quietly and disappearing back outside. "Did you and that bird just talk?" Tyler asked weakly. "Yes." "And did it call you Allie?" "Yes." "Can I call you Allie?" Allison smiled. "No."